I go by Jim Matlock, although my professional name is James. So I've been, well, I'm an anthropologist by profession, although before I got into anthropology, I was interested in parapsychology. In fact, my reincarnation interest goes back to around 1980. My first choice of career is actually writing. I wanted to be a creative writer. But I found it was difficult to make a living at that, and was looking for another topic to write on, and that's when I discovered reincarnation. And the more I read about it, the more intrigued I became, and that's what led me into psychical research. It's what led me to Stevenson's work, and once I found that and realized that there was serious work being done in this area, I was hooked, and so that's how I got involved with this, with psychical research and reincarnation research in particular. And so I've been at it ever since. So I guess 1980 to 1920, 40 years. It doesn't seem like that long, but I guess it's been 40.
And just if we end up talking over each other, just for anyone listening, there's a very prominent delay from both of our sides, so I'll try not to interrupt you, Jim, but I can't do much about the delay, unfortunately. It's a pain, but there we go. And anyone that doesn't know who Dr. Ian Stevenson is, he was certainly probably one of the most well-known pioneers of I want to say near death of reincarnation cases, and did a lot of publications on that subject for, I believe it was the Society of Psychical Research.
Well, he was at one point. He was president of the SPR, but he was more associated actually with the American SPR in New York. He was Canadian by birth, but yes, he was a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia. They hired him actually in a tenured position, just as he was getting interested in parapsychology and psychical research. And just as he was beginning his reincarnation work, that was in 1961, was the first time he went into the field. So yes, he was the pioneer in this, in the systematic study of reincarnation.
Mm-hmm. So could you kind of relate to some of the most indicative cases of that serve as the most indicative evidence of the truth of reincarnation, and from either your own or Dr. Stevenson's research, or indeed any in the field?
Right. Well, let me use one of my own cases. It's one that I worked on for my last book, which is also called Signs of Reincarnation. It was published by Rowman and Littlefield, an academic publisher, which I'm quite proud of, because most books on reincarnation are not written for an academic audience. This one was. But it starts off with this case. It's of an Oklahoma girl named O'Reilly O'Banion, who before she started talking about memories, was behaving in ways that can only be described really as sort of representing a post-traumatic stress. She would sleepwalk almost every night. She would complain about her clothing, her shirts, that they hurt her, her neck, her shoulders, her back. Wanted tags cut out of her shirts. This is when she's 2 and 3, 4. Now, when she was 3, her mother had pictures taken of her and the rest of the family. And one of those pictures in particular, just one of them, it seemed to stimulate memories. And she would tell her mother, this is beginning at age 3, that she was bigger in that picture. Well, this made no sense at all to her mother. I mean, how could she be bigger in a picture? Her mother's pointing out, well, she's 3, how can she be bigger in the picture? But every time she saw the picture, and her mother had it in her office at work, and so, she didn't see it every day, but every time she went there, she would make the same comment about the picture. Well, this went on actually for 3 years. It wasn't until she was 6 that she began to have clearer memories. And at that point, she told her mother, she reminded her of this picture, said, "You remember that picture where I was bigger before?" And Mom said, "Yes." And she started to argue with her again about it. And she said, "I died." And so it took her until 6, so several years of these behaviors before she began to have enough conscious memories to be able to understand that she was recalling a previous life. Um, and after that, she gradually began to remember more and more. And what she remembered was um, being killed when a plane crashed into her house. A plane crashed into her house. I mean, this almost sounds fantastical. She was talking about this. Her mother, her brother asked her, where she had lived before, where she wasn't quite sure. Maybe it was Canada, maybe it was Louisiana. She thought the date 1971 sounded significant, but she wasn't quite sure why. She wasn't. But anyway, these gave her mother some clues, enough clues to go to the internet and Google this. Try Googling 1971 plane crashes, Canada, Louisiana. Nothing in 1971, nothing in Canada. But there was a plane crash in 1982 in Louisiana, in the New Orleans airport, in a suburb named Kenner. Now, Kenner may sound more or less like Canada to a small child, maybe. So that could be where the Canada link came from, but it was Kenner. There was a Pan Am crash in 1982. At the time, this was the third worst aviation accident in US aviation history. The plane took off from the airport, caught a wind shear, low altitude wind shear, and crashed into a residential neighborhood less than a mile from the end of the runway. Everybody on the plane was killed, and 6 people on the ground were killed. One of those on the ground was a girl, a child, who was in the carport of her house, which is exactly what Rylan was remembering. When I interviewed her at age 10, she told me that she remembered sitting on a swing in a carport. A swing in a carport? I'd never heard of a swing in a carport. And I asked her, "Are you sure the swing wasn't in the yard? The swing set, maybe?" No, and it wasn't on the porch of the house. It was in the carport. She was quite definite about that. She was sitting in the swing in the carport, talking on the telephone, when she saw the plane coming towards her. And then she said that she got electrocuted over the telephone line, and she died of electrocution. But when she was looking towards the plane, well, actually, I'm getting a little bit ahead here, because so after interviewing her, I went to Kenner to interview people there. Remember, Stevenson interviewed people on both sides. So that's what I did, emulating Stevenson. So I went to talk with people who had known the person that we had now identified as being the probable person whose life she remembered, right? And I went back to their old house. As it turns out, and stood in the position that she would have been. The house has since been torn down. The house was demolished in the crash anyway. And the carport was ruined. But but the driveway was still there, and the house had been rebuilt, or a new house had been built there. And the driveway was still there. So I stood in the driveway. And from the driveway, the view was of trees, of a utility pole. Anyway, I sent a picture from what I saw from the driveway to Rylan's mother, who immediately made the connection and sent me back a picture of what Rylan would have seen when she was standing in the yard and had that picture taken of her. In other words, it's not the picture of Rylan herself. It was a picture of what Rylan would have seen when she was standing in that
from
position.
Rylan's point of view.
And the yeah, so the cemetery was the similarity between what Jennifer Schultz would have seen at her death and what Ryland saw when that picture was taken is remarkable. And so her mother and I realized that what she was doing when she looked at the picture was then that was cueing right memories. That was the association back to these memories. And that's why, as a 3-year-old child, she got confused and was trying to explain, that she saw something similar, that she was older, she just couldn't explain it right. So this all began to make sense, right? Okay, the swing in the carport. Well, it turns out that indeed in that neighborhood, there were carports with swings. They're like porch swings, but they were in the carports. And walking around that neighborhood, I found another house not far away that had not been damaged in the crash that still had a carport. I mean, it still had a swing in the carport. Plenty of room for the car next to the swing, but there's a swing in the carport. So indeed, Jennifer, the way these are constructed, the door to the kitchen went into the carport, right? So this is 1982. I mean, you didn't have cell phones then. You didn't have, you had only very primitive wireless phones. So most likely the phone was on a wire running out of the kitchen, but it would have reached, to the swing, to the swing. And so it's quite plausible that she was sitting on the swing, even though this was not something that was picked up in the news stories. There were a number of news stories written about this crash. Obviously, it was a very big thing, but none of them talked about her being on a swing in the carport. They all missed that. None of them, in fact, put her in the carport at all. I went and I obtained her autopsy report, and her autopsy report said that her body had been recovered from the carport. So she did, in fact, that places her in the carport. It also means she died in the carport. And the autopsy said that there was no soot in the trachea, is that there was no smoke, that she had died before the plane reached her. Remember, Ryland said that she'd been electrocuted. Her body, when recovered, was 100% burned. So any marks of electrocution, would have been erased from her body, from her skin. There's no way of confirming that. But the autopsy report makes clear that somehow or other she died before the plane reached her. Now, as it turns out, passing right in front of the house, on the house side of the street, were electrical lines and telephone lines running next to each other on the same pole. And I learned that in 1982, the electrical lines in that neighborhood were not insulated. So, and the plane coming towards the house would have had to have sliced through those, we know it hit the house, and we know it sliced the, this is simply a fact. I mean, it did slice through the power lines and the telephone lines. What we don't know, but can surmise, is that they came into contact. And if they did come into contact, then it is very possible that an electrical impulse would have been sent up the telephone line, and that Ryland could have been electrocuted that way. No proof, but it's plausible, entirely plausible. So here we have Ryland remembering something that is not documented anywhere, nowhere. So it's not something that could have been gotten clairvoyantly. It's not something that she could have read anywhere and remembered. There really isn't any plausible explanation for how she knew that, other than she remembered it. And so this is how these cases work. I mean, this is what you do. you go out, you collect all of this information, and then you try to see if there any plausible way that you can. And when you get a case like this, where you really there's a key element here that there really is no other good explanation for, that you have to say, well, maybe she really did have memories of Jennifer's life. And in fact, it's much more than that, because she also had, her personality turned out to be very similar to Jennifer. When I talked to her friends asked me, about whether she liked to make crafts, for instance, in particular crafts. Like she liked to make crosses at Christmas time, and one of the things particularly prized by her friends was a little owl on a stick. Well, when I talked to Jennifer's family, I hadn't heard about crafts, but they hadn't. It would never have occurred to them to mention that. I mean, they wouldn't have connected that to Jennifer's. But I went back then to Ryland's family and asked them about crafts, and sure enough, Ryland makes crafts, and the same crafts. She made little crosses and give them to her friends at Christmas time. She made an owl on a stick, very similar. So, you put all of this together, and it gets to be beyond coincidence, because you have to ask, at what point do all these coincidences get you to the point of being beyond coincidence? And they do in these cases. And so this is this is the sort of thing that the skeptics don't grapple with. They start by making assumptions that this cannot be right, and so most of them haven't even bothered to read any reports at all. And this is clear from the statements that they make about them.
I think one of the most popular arguments you'd have from the skeptical side for something like that would be they'd bring up the God of the Gaps fallacy. So in this case, it's unexplainable, therefore it's paranormal, and they don't kind of like that idea because they think it's unscientific. But as you say, you could also argue that it is coincidental. But first of all, there's so many of these cases that it's you can say that they're all coincidences, but it's also the depth and the content of those coincidences that make it so unlikely to occur. Not just the fact that one coincidental thing happened, but it's the depth of which that coincidence must be in order for that to be the case, and it seems rather implausible.
Yes, that's right, and it's not just the reincarnation cases; it's the consistency between the reincarnation cases and near-death experiences, and apparitions, and mediumistic communications. All of this coming together, which is very consistent. But there is the skeptics are right on, and that is that we need a theory. We need a way of explaining this. We need a mechanism that makes sense. And that's something I've been working on. That's been a particular interest of mine, developing a theory, because I think that that until we have an acceptable theory, that there is always the possibility that that they can be explained in some other way. Now, any adequate theory of reincarnation, though, is not going to be compatible with materialism. It can't be. The only theories that are adequate to materialism are ones that explain the data away. The ones the skeptics favor, that it's fantasy, that it's the parents imposing identities on the children, that it's faulty memories, and all of this stuff. So we have to start off acknowledging that any adequate theory of reincarnation that goes counter to materialism has that strike already against it from the materialist point of view. And so in a more general sense, what has to happen is materialism has to be successfully undermined. And this is beginning to happen. uh, more and more people, academics, scientists, and fields are questioning materialism, everywhere from philosophy to quantum physics. They're really questioning whether the materialistic idea, the physicalistic idea that consciousness is generated by the brain uh, works. Um, and so and so the whole materialistic point of view is beginning to break down. And keep in mind, science, this is the way science works, right? I mean, there are a lot of things that we know now to be true that, were once thought to be wrong, right? And not just big things, like we now appreciate that the world is not flat, and we appreciate that the earth revolves around the sun, not just big things like that. We can go back, just a few decades to continental drift and plate tectonics. There was a time in the 1960s, as recently as the 1960s, that was still considered pseudoscientific. Continental drift was first suggested in the 1920s, but for decades there was no mechanism. People didn't understand how it could work, and they didn't believe in it. They thought continents were fixed, and so there was no way that they could understand continental drift, and just do it. Now, shall we say, it's the bedrock of geology. Continental drift is. They can't. Everything depends on it now. But that hasn't always been the case. And so science changes, right? It changes its ideas. It evolves. And ideally, it ought to evolve in line with the data. Science ought to be data-led. Ideally, it is. That's what science is supposed to be about, right? Collection of data, study of data, systematic study of data, building hypotheses based on the data, testing of those hypotheses, and if data is collected that questions, the given theory, then you follow the data. This is what happened with quantum physics at the end of the 19th century. Materialistic ideas growing out of Newtonian ideas, Newtonian physics were, that was science. And at the end of the 19th century, it was really believed that, science had really gotten to the end, that it was just mopping up from then on. Well, but then at the beginning of the 20th century, when they started working on some of the outstanding problems like light, explaining light and realizing that light can be understood either as a particle or as a wave, that led then into an entirely different way of understanding physical reality. And that's quantum mechanics and quantum physics. It's 20th century, early 20th century stuff. And we were led into that through the experiments on light, and then through theory, trying to explain those results. And the only way to explain them really was to develop this entirely new theory, and to show not so much that the old physics was wrong, but that it was partial. The old physics of reality, but with the very small and the very large, it breaks down. So we're in a similar sort of situation now. I mean, we already know that materialism breaks down when you get to the very small and very large. So how then can we be so sure that that consciousness is generated by the brain? I mean, why can we can't presume that anymore. So the door is already open to thinking beyond materialism, and that's all it takes. Once we start thinking beyond materialism and start accepting the idea that maybe consciousness is not generated by the brain, and that consciousness might have an existence independent of the brain, then we can start looking seriously at all of the evidence that we now have, all of the evidence that has been communicated, that has been accumulated in psychic research and parapsychology. Since the founding of the Society for Psychic Research in 1882, long time now. All that evidence which suggests something non-material to the human being, we can start taking that seriously, right? And once we start taking that seriously and beginning to realize, hey, this isn't just a theoretical idea, there's actually evidence for it. Then, we begin to be able to appreciate the evidence that Stevenson developed for reincarnation. So this is beginning to happen. It's beginning to happen, but there's still a lot of resistance to it. And as the saying goes, science advances one death at a time. It's going to take another generation or two, but I believe it's going to come. It has to come, because actually those of us working on these problems are on the right side. I mean, it's very obvious when you get into this material that we are. I mean, there is no other way of explaining these things.
Just to move on briefly, Jim, to Ian Stevenson himself, he was very well known as somebody who followed the scientific method very rigorously and was acclaimed very widely for it. Well, there are several who claim that he's a pseudoscientist whose methods are very questionable at best. I found actually an article that says, I'd like to get your opinion on it. I'll just give you a brief quote from it. This is from skepdic.com. What possesses a man of Stevenson's intelligence to chase after chimeras and produce thousands of pages of detailed reports that amount to a heap of rationalizations? As Michael Shermer succinctly puts it, smart people believe weird things because they are skilled at defending beliefs they arrive at for non-smart reasons. Stevenson spent about half his life trying to find support for his beliefs in reincarnation and their relationship to medicine. The beliefs came first, the intelligence was applied to confirm the beliefs. So I think that's generally how most people see, generally a lot of people that work in this area, and that comes down to cognitive bias, doesn't it? So I wonder what your opinion is on that.
We have to try to unpack this. I think there's several issues here. One, the most general one is I think we can turn this skeptical position back on them. They are the ones really who have the blinders on. They're the ones who are insisting upon seeing things through the prism of their preconceived mindset, and aren't allowing themselves actually to think beyond that. And even consider the possibility that there might be evidence that would lead them in a different direction. And so for them, those skeptics who are committed to a materialist point of view, materialism, of course, is the philosophical idea, and it is a philosophical position, idea that everything about reality is material, begins with the material. And if you take that position, then there's nothing immaterial. So the mind or consciousness have to be produced by the brain, right? And so when you take that position, then there's no possibility of survival. There's no possibility of psi or any psychic thing. And as a consequence, there can be no reincarnation. If there can't be survival of consciousness, there can't be a reincarnation of consciousness. Follows. So if you start with the materialist position and are committed to it, then you rule out from the start any possibility of anything else. And that's where they begin, and that's where they end, consequently. Because they cannot admit that Stevenson was data-led rather than philosophy-led. But Stevenson was, in fact, data-led. Yes, his mind was open to the possibility of something other than the material. But his field investigations were aimed precisely at determining whether there was something more here than could be explained simply as fantasy or as parental impositions of identity, in these sort of normal ways, or whether we had to bring in some other explanation for them. And so yes, there's a lot of debate. This gets to another one of the questions here. There's a lot of debate about whether Stevenson's methodology was scientific. Well, a lot of that has to do with the presumption that science is about laboratory experiments in the laboratory, and so anything outside the laboratory is called anecdotal. Is simply, and is put down. There's also the assumption that the only true science is science that is behaviorist science, so that anything that questions behaviorism can't be science by definition, and therefore is cast as pseudoscience. But at any rate, so Stevenson was engaged in case studies, which then many people dismiss simply as anecdotal. But Stevenson's methods, though, went beyond simply the anecdotal. But if you call something anecdotal, you think of it simply as being a story. And the implication is that he went out and he simply collected stories. But that's not what he did. He went out and he talked to people. In his typical cases, a young child has memories of a previous life. So he would talk to the child if the child still has memories and is willing to talk to him. He would talk to his parents and his elder siblings and any friends and anyone who had heard him talk about these things. He would talk to everybody, and he talked to them repeatedly over a period of years to check on memory accuracy and things like that. And he was particularly interested in the memories that had been confirmed. So these are cases in which the children remember things that actually check out. They remember having been people who can be shown to have existed. So after talking with everybody on the subject side of the family, Stevenson went and repeated the efforts then on the previous side of the family. He talked to everybody connected to the person now deceased about that person's life, to try to independently confirm that the memories of the child did indeed match that previous person. He went further than that and sought out any sort of written records he could find. Like, for instance, if the previous person had been killed, there might be medical records, there might be autopsy records. Stevenson would collect that sort of thing and see if he could match it up to any injuries then on the child, and very often, indeed, they did match. Another major dimension of these cases, which the skeptics usually do not like to deal with at all, they just avoid, is the behaviors. Once the identification is made to somebody, you can actually see that the personality and the behaviors of the previous person are then represented again, reproduced in the subject of the case. So it's not just memories that carry over, it's behaviors which seem to carry over, and also physical things which are then reproduced. So you have to look at all of these elements of the case together. And this is what Stevenson did. He looked at all of the elements of the case together. And he looked at it in a very intensive way by interviewing people and collecting documents. And that means his case is much more than simply anecdotal. And it's really unfair to then dismiss his methodology as being non-scientific or pseudoscientific, just because it wasn't didn't follow laboratory methods, or because or because in the end his interpretations went against materialism.
Yeah. I think the main kind of crux of this article is that he seemed to start with the conclusion or the belief and then found evidence to support that. Would you say that that's accurate of his workings? Or
no, it's not. I mean, that's something the skeptics like to say. He went in with the question on his mind. Is this something we need to take seriously or not? When he first went to India, his first field trip was to India and Sri Lanka in 1961. And he knew about a few cases at the time. And that's what he went to see what he could find out about them. He went with the expectation that basically what he was looking at is simply memories. And he went with the background in psychical research and with the question principally of whether there's anything paranormal here. Whether it could be shown that the child had was saying things that he had no normal way of knowing, right? And he was surprised to find that the cases also had these behavioral features I was talking about, and that in addition to that, there were also these physical. So those are things that he didn't go in looking for. Those are things that he learned about in the process of studying cases. And he went in with the idea of determining whether there was anything to the cases, not with the not with the conclusion. He didn't start off with the conclusion, yes, there's something to them. He went in with the question, is there something to them? And that's a very different sort of position. So yes, the skeptics like to say that he went in with his position, and that colors everything because he was just seeking proof for his prior ideas. But that's exactly what they do. I mean, they have their commitment, and they're seeking ways to reinterpret his cases in line with their expectations. So, but no, that's not true of Stevenson.